You're listening to the Veteran Etc. podcast, as there's always more to be said about a veteran. Join your host, Mike Kim, a veteran, ex-monk, seasoned war trauma therapist, and writer, as he shares his years of research in veteran readjustment culture and the meaning of warrior life. Now, here's your host, Mike Kim.
Veteran Etc. This is a show devoted to veterans and their daily lives, not just the articles, the magazines, the movies, but the interpersonal, intersubjective relationships veterans have amongst themselves and their relationships with the greater society. I'm your host, Mike Kim, and I served as a veteran. I served in Iraq and served in the military 4 different times. At the same time, I'm a psychoanalyst, presently doing research at Columbia University Teachers College as an independent researcher. I focus on my concept of veteran military readjustment culture. In this episode, I'm looking at veterans and narcissism. As a psychoanalyst who's had over 20 years of experience in the clinical realm, as well as over 20 years working with veterans, I notice the word narcissism that has recently been something as a mass media phenomenon, much like attachment style, attachment theory, gaslighting, love bombing, and these other terms that pop psychology has used to explain certain behaviors coming out of human beings. Let me just say that this audio essay, Veterans and Narcissism, is not an essay dealing with NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. This is more looking at narcissism as far as phenomenon noticed by Freud, but expanded upon by Heinz Kohut, the leading authority on self-psychology. He would be known as the Chicago School of Psychoanalysis founder. The mind is an expansive part of the human being. Many look at the human being as an individual dwelling on the outside, or not so much the outside, and possibly focusing too much on the inside, looking out. How about a dialogue that I bring up and that can be very useful for veterans and those treating veterans and those who are family members of veterans? And that would be the aspect of the mind where the inside is looking deeper within. As Heinz Kohut spoke about, the self-objects. Not so much the objects from outside, but the creation of objects that individuals make from within. Let's just say that the outer world is taken in by the individual. In this case, the veteran. Whether the veteran was wearing the uniform or the veteran is one of those celebrity veterans out on the internet. Someone like a David Goggins or a Dan Crenshaw or Rudy Reyes. And let's just say, folks like me, not so famous, possibly you, or you know of a veteran. And what's common in all these types of veterans that I present is that we have the potential as veterans to look within, I believe, and to find the different self-objects that we create from the connections that we have, not just from our birth, right? Not just from what Heinz Kohut speaks about in his book, Analysis of the Self, a book written back in 1971. And, articles written by Dr. McLean from the National Institute of Health, 2007, in psychiatry using Heinz Kohut's self-psychology in working with patients, or in Jessica Nagam's article, Narcissism, Kohut's Thoughts on Self-Love, found in depthpsychology.org. In these different sources, I take a leap in placing Kohut's understanding of self-objects and self-love in many ways, so that the veteran and those tied to veterans and those treating veterans can better understand the veteran from a Kohutian perspective, from Heinz Kohut's perspective. Kohut is revolutionary because, unlike what Mahler and Bowlby spoke about in regards to attachment theory, the latest craze in the dating relationship world, Heinz Kohut gives a deeper, I might not say deeper, but maybe an interesting attempt to understand attachment, but from another perspective. And that is from understanding the self as far as the self-loving individual. According to Heinz Kohut, and going against many in his field, Kohut believed that there could be a healthy sense of self-love, that we are all born into a certain level of narcissism, a certain level of, how could I say it, where we are exhibiting ourselves to our parents and others. We're showing off when we are children for a sense of love, for a sense of attachment, for a sense of validation. This is important to recognize because this also follows us when we're in the military. Much like our parents, the military, the commanders, the units, team members, sergeants, etc., they all represent three interesting things that Kohut talks about. And that's the necessity for a fit. And so, much like a parent and a child has to experience a certain level of fit, connection, a certain level of attunement, that's also necessary when you join a unit. And that's why it's very interesting that the United States military uses a basic training boot camp that is very developmental in its structure. And it offers somewhat of a an artificial parental system. The other thing is, besides the sense of fitness, there's also a connection of reaction and nurturing that's also important, not just from the command, but by fellow military personnel towards that one individual person wearing the uniform. This isn't to provide some type of special treatment, but at the same time, special accommodations according to that group's need, or that sailor, airman, marine, coasties need. This is important to look at because I feel that the different mental breakdowns as well as disciplinary actions that occur in the military might be tied to this type of injury that might occur. It's almost like a narcissistic injury. It's almost as if looking at, a child falling off his or her bicycle and not really knowing what happened, right? Being in a state of shock. And, well, how does a unit respond to it? No matter how grave, what type of empathic response can be given, including when errors are committed during war, including when equipment or men, women are lost. We still must look at that dimension of our reaction towards that person in the military. That includes you, the perfect one, the one with godlike performance, or you, the one who is performing minimally. It's important to pay attention to these type of issues because in the veteran affairs medical healthcare system, we also have to pay attention to finding the fit therapists for that veteran, right? So the hospital, the vet center, the private agency working with veterans needs to kind of like look at that and pay attention, much like I mentioned before. And the hospital, the clinic, the vet center, the nonprofit needs to also react and provide the proper nurture that's involved in regards to veteran care. The last, trait that can be looked at from Kohut's thinking that is useful in the military as well as veteran care systems is, what does that veteran service person need in regards to cultivating the self-love, the self object? What is needed? And in Kohut's thinking, it's important to have a certain level of empathy, a mirroring effect, as if, okay, things are going bad, whether at home or in a war zone or in the barracks. And how is that clinician, how is that NCO, how is that wife or husband going to respond? What type of empathy can be there when things go south for the veteran or for that person in uniform? I leave that question to you. I leave that question to you as the responder, as the person who mirrors the experience of the veteran or the person presently wearing a uniform. The other thing is that the philosopher Hegel discusses the self from a perspective of that you do not exist, the self, unless there is an other, the other. That other could be your drill instructor at boot camp, your company commander while you're in the fleet, your vet center counselor after you've finished your military service, or your child, your grown-up child, and you could be aging like me. So what are these different mirroring dynamics that would be tied to feeling a sense of empathy, but also a certain sense of admiration? We need to have people we admire in our environments, either in a war zone, in the barracks, or in our home. That's where I would call on, Heinz Kohut doesn't say this, but I say this, a certain type of ethical living that is promoting life in a very positive way. Even under the worst environments, one can look at life in this kind of way. Look at the movie A Beautiful Life by Bellini. This movie is tremendous as we're dealing with Nazi Germany, actually Nazi fascist Italy, and a Jewish Italian family is ruined by the Holocaust reality. And yet at the camp, the father plays an instrumental role as far as treating his son. It's almost like a peer while also being a father. And that mutual admiration, that mutual attunement giving between father and son is something almost magically seen on screen. There's also a certain level of a likeness in the sense that we need to connect with others in not just admiring or receiving love from others and care, but that there's a connection where we feel that there are others like us going through the same thing, and that the ups and downs of life are like connected. It's not just within our parents that we can find this, but I have found that in the military with men like Yanwin Bay, Force Recon Marine, when I was very young in my military experience, or when I was a young officer in the Coast Guard. Pedros Munoz Dones, another great figure. Or while I was at Norwich University in Vermont, the Military College of Vermont, and I had different peers, like my mate, uh, barracks mate Christolus, Robert Oles, and a few others, Richard Gavoni, if I could mention some names, and others. Please forgive me if I don't include you, but you're in my mind right now, just lost. And I'll get to you in the future in another episode. But these folks influence one in the journey of life. And if this episode does not focus on narcissism as far as its ugly head, well, it's because I'm looking at narcissism from a perspective of self-love, in the sense that when narcissism is seen from a healthy perspective, when it is something that is not focused on an overestimation of inferiority or an underestimation of inferiority, it can be a healthy way of asserting confidence, sense of self, as far as being a leader, as far as an NCO, being a platoon commander, company commander, being a regimental commander, being a divisional commander, being commander in chief. These are important things to look at. And when we look at our commanders, our NCOs, even our president, even these people in special operations who are given vast responsibilities, can we look at these people and say that there's a healthy narcissism at play when they speak? Or is there other things coming out, such as an inflated ego? Or can it be, as I might interpret, for example, the departure from Afghanistan? Many people think that that departure happened on August 20th, 2021, and this is not being political, but it actually started, if you look at the different happenings, the departure from Afghanistan outside of the media, but through the different historical documents, started in February 29th, 2020. And so there was over a year where there was a departure from Afghanistan. It, like in the Korean War or like in the Vietnam War, not an adequate departure. But certain leaders and certain media pundits and certain people who never created foreign policy yet were on the ground, maybe in special operations, with a heavy voice as far as talking about the withdrawal of Afghanistan being as something that was not right. Whether it was right or wrong, we can look at documents that conclude that the departure began back in February, and it led to the departure of August 20th, 2021. We can also assume that troops and those in Afghanistan were let down. I can say in Iraq, we still have troops, but there was a massive departure. And my area was affected by ISIS after. But this was bound to happen one way or another. Much like the fall of Saigon, it was going to happen one way or another. And to look at having a healthy sense of narcissism is to recognize that we are not responsible for all of these happenings. We need not internalize these things, whether we get a parade for our war, as in being in the Iraq war myself, or just being so wrecked that the war in Iraq just completely failed or was a complete success. All I know is one healthy approach to this is that I served my country, and my country sent me to Iraq. And in that, I served, and I was lucky to come home. Others did not come home. Others came home and have invisible and visible wounds from that war. I must say that when we look at Heinz Kohut's approach to self-love, to the self-objects that we create in our minds, we can develop a healthy narcissism through these different societal challenges that we can experience and transcend. I will say that mass media needs a serious overhaul in their unhealthy narcissism, as well as certain politicians who pursue war without valid and just reasons, or promote the continued occupations of countries, or the funding of the military-industrial complex in an unrealistic $1 trillion way. These are narcissistic, unhealthy expressions that recede into our society. What are ways that we can healthily approach a certain level of self-love in our here and now as we wear the uniform and when we let go of the uniform?
Veteran Etc. invites you to join us again with your host, Mike Kim, every Sunday. If the content from this podcast is informative to you, please share the podcast with others. Give a like and or post something you learned from the episode on social media. If interested in other truly informative podcasts like Veteran Etc., check out cominghomewell.com for a listing of other veteran-based podcasts. Thank you for tuning in.